Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Coronavirus cases continue to surge across the U.S., with hospitalizations close to record highs. More than 60,000 Americans are now hospitalized with the virus, and facilities across the country are reaching capacity. Many Americans are once again lining up for testing at levels we had not seen since the summer. Meanwhile, more than 100,000 cases of COVID-19 have been confirmed every day for the past week. One advisor to President-elect Biden says that number could soon double. Janet Shamlian has the latest.
Breaking news tonight. The nation's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, says he expects the Pfizer vaccine to go through the FDA's emergency authorization process in the next week and a half.
By the time we get into December, we'll be able to have doses available for people who are judged to be at the highest priority.
The latest COVID hotspot is the entire nation.
There's no question that our hospitals are about to be overrun. Do not be at all surprised when we hit 200,000 cases a day.
That's Dr. Michael Osterholm, newly named to President-elect Biden's Coronavirus Advisory Board.
How bad did it get for you?
It felt like a bad flu.
Dr. Julio Novoa is an El Paso OBGYN who got the virus and passed it to his wife.
It's something scary. It's your life. It could be life or death.
In the Chicago area, hours-long waits for testing. More than 100,000 in Illinois tested on Monday alone. 15 states have seen coronavirus hospitalizations double in the last month, including New Mexico, where hospitalizations tripled in a month, as Des Moines hospitals are at capacity, even the Children's Hospital. A stark warning in Oklahoma.
If our current rate of infection is not curbed, we will run out of beds and of staff.
And dire predictions in Minnesota.
The fear is once you lose control, this line would go off the top of the television screen here.
In Idaho, one of the state's largest hospitals had to temporarily send patients away the last 2 weekends. No room. Amid COVID fatigue, some scenes of defiance, including in El Paso today, where we found this clothing store open, despite a lockdown on non-essential businesses. Dr. Novoa says he learned the consequences can be severe.
As a dad, as a husband, when you were sick, did you allow yourself to think about how bad it could get?
The first day, I really worried, what happens if I die? That was the only day I allowed myself to really think about it, the first day.
Tonight there is some startling new information from the American Academy of Pediatrics. They are reporting the highest weekly increase in cases among children since the pandemic started. Elaine?
Janet Shamlian, thank you. Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine is on track to be approved for use as early as next month, and other potential vaccines could soon follow. But as David Martin reports, these drug companies still face the enormous challenge of getting their shots to the public.
The Pfizer plant in Michigan is now the leading edge of the crash program to inoculate America. Its vaccine stored in 350 ultra-cold freezers waiting for FDA approval.
D-Day is the first round.
Army General Gus Perna, in charge of delivering the vaccine, has been counting on Pfizer to be the first and the most difficult to distribute because it requires 2 shots.
Second dose has to be targeted to the people that already received the first dose. It's essential to our success.
You'll have the needles and syringes.
Marion Wicker, one of Perna's deputies, showed 60 Minutes the Pfizer vaccine kit, complete with the card telling you when to come back for your second shot.
How many of these are going to get lost?
Probably quite a few, which is why we are recommending to all the administrators to tell people to take pictures of it.
The Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. To New Jersey Health Commissioner Judith Persicelli, that means the shots will have to be given in hospitals already swamped by COVID.
My biggest fear is that we're dealing with a surge at the same time that we're trying to vaccinate.
Healthcare workers are likely to be the first to get shots, and General Perna estimates that alone could take 3 months. David Martin, CBS News, Washington.
President-elect Joe Biden has blasted President Trump's refusal to concede the election, calling it an embarrassment, and saying the move could hurt Mr. Trump's legacy. But the president-elect's team says that is not stopping them from moving forward with their transition plans. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has the latest.
President-elect Joe Biden today briefing reporters 3 days after he declared victory, but forced to address the fact that President Trump refuses to concede.
Well, I just think it's an embarrassment, quite frankly. The only thing that, how can I say this tactfully? I think it will not help the president's legacy.
Mr. Biden spoke out as the Trump administration continues to block the president-elect's transition team from accessing federal agencies and funding needed to conduct the traditional transfer of power. And as many of the president's congressional allies refuse to dispute Mr. Trump's baseless claims of widespread voter fraud.
The whole Republican Party has been put in a position, with a few notable exceptions, of being mildly intimidated by the sitting president.
Mr. Biden is getting support from several world leaders. The heads of Germany, France, Ireland, and the United Kingdom all making congratulatory phone calls today. Once he takes office, the president-elect says he wants to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement, both of which President Trump famously withdrew from. In a normal transition, Mr. Biden already would be receiving classified briefings from top intelligence officials about global concerns. But the Trump administration is so far refusing to let them do so. Today, the president-elect said he isn't worried.
But there's only one president at a time. He's president.
As we've been reporting, President Trump insists he can still win the election. The president has not appeared before reporters in several days, but on Twitter, he's continuing to falsely allege election fraud without providing any proof. This comes as Attorney General William Barr gives the Justice Department the green light to investigate claims of voter fraud despite a lack of evidence. CBS News White House correspondent Ben Tracy has the latest.
President Trump tonight still refusing to concede, firing off baseless tweets from behind the walls of the White House, claiming he'll still win and alleging ballot counting abuse. Twitter flagging that, noting voter fraud of any kind is exceedingly rare. Today, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo backing the president's false narrative that he actually won.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
President Trump has played 2 rounds of golf but hasn't spoken publicly since last Thursday.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win.
And for the 5th day in a row, there are no public events on his official schedule. According to his public schedule, the president hasn't attended an intelligence briefing since October 1st. Mr. Trump's last revealed call with a foreign leader was more than 10 days ago, and he hasn't met with his coronavirus task force in months.
Try to facilitate a transition that ensures our president-elect is successful.
4 years ago today, then President Obama welcomed President-elect Trump to the White House. But sources say Mr. Trump has no plans to return the favor for Joe Biden. Many Republicans on Capitol Hill aren't acknowledging Biden's win either, as my colleague Nancy Cordes found.
Have you spoken to Vice President Biden yet?
I have not.
Do you believe he won the election? Senator, have you congratulated Vice President Biden yet?
No.
Why not? The race was closer in 2016, and Republicans congratulated President Trump then.
Well, I can tell you that, there's a lot of challenges out there still, so I think we need to get all the votes.
Meanwhile, the Trump campaign's lawsuits are going nowhere. Some White House officials privately admit the effort is mainly to delay the president having to admit defeat. But now, in a highly unusual move, Attorney General William Barr is suggesting federal prosecutors quickly investigate any substantial allegations of voting irregularities. But even he doesn't seem convinced, cautioning against fanciful or far-fetched claims.
Ed O'Keefe and Ben Tracy join me now. So Ed, as you mentioned in your piece, the president-elect's transition team is pushing ahead despite the Trump administration's efforts to block resources. What is currently on the transition agenda for President-elect Biden, and how does his team plan to proceed without help from the federal government?
Sure. Well, look, they're focused on the big picture stuff, doing a lot of public-facing events and sort of naming
some top-level people that are going to be involved in the ongoing transition. Remember, yesterday it was conversations about COVID and Biden and Harris introducing their new COVID task force, people who will help them think ahead about how they could tackle the pandemic once it's over. Today it was a focus on health care and the Affordable Care Act as the Supreme Court was hearing the case that once again challenges the legality of the law. They said they would continue to protect and expand the Affordable Care Act once they take over, and that if the Supreme Court rules to take parts of it, away, that they would sort that out. And also kind of said to Republicans, you would want to help us with that, wouldn't you? Because these elections showed how popular the law can be. Beyond that, he's taking calls now from world leaders. He's going back to one of his strengths, foreign policy, or at least one of those things that he spent a lot of his time on back in the day. He's now spoken with 5 world leaders of Canada, the United Kingdom, Ireland, France, and Germany. Essentially 5 that you would probably take a call from this early on. But CBS News has learned tonight that the State Department is playing no role in those conversations. Usually diplomats would be involved and listening in to at least protect national security. But because the Trump administration continues to block agencies from cooperating with the Biden-Harris transition, this is one of the many domestic and national security and foreign policy aspects of the transition that they're not really able to do like they would normally.
And Ed, you have some reporting on how the Biden-Harris team is considering legal action if the Trump administration continues to delay the transition. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so last night, Elaine, after hours, if you will, transition officials told reporters that they were considering all sorts of options if the Trump administration continues to hold up the work of a transition, which includes, making sure that about 500 volunteers can go into federal agencies and begin looking into what exactly might need to be done, how things might have to be cleaned up. And at this point, that's not happening. So they were saying that, legal action is potentially one of the potential avenues. But today, in his news conference here in Wilmington, the former vice president seemed to rule that out and say there's no need to go that route yet, that he is confident that when all is said and done, this will get sorted out by some point in the coming weeks, and a transition will be able to continue. There are some experts that we've talked to here at CBS News that suggest that this, need to get into the agencies and start looking around isn't necessarily that big a deal. But in reality, if you're somebody who's going to get nominated, for example, to be, say, Agriculture Secretary or head of the Food and Drug Administration, you're going to want to know what you're walking into. And that is what this is designed to do, is to begin to sort of conduct a status report, get a sense of who's still there, what percentage of the staff might be retiring in the next few years, who you'd have to replace, what the Trump administration is trying to get done in the closing weeks. And if they don't have eyes on that, it makes governing at all levels and on all issues that much more difficult when they begin on January 20th.
Well, Ben, we heard Secretary of State Mike Pompeo say there would be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. Several Republican senators have also yet to accept the results of the election. Is there any indication how long the president intends to maintain his stance?
Well, that was a pretty striking thing to hear the Secretary of State say today, especially when you consider that the State Department is often involved in criticizing other countries for how they carry out their elections when we, the United States, don't think they're being done free and fairly. So that was interesting. But in terms of how long the president and his allies might keep this up, there are some that expect that the president will never concede this race, that he will always say that he won and that the only reason that the election turned out for Joe Biden was because it was rigged and there was fraud. So we'll have to see if he changes his tune. There are some hard and fast dates, though, that I think we should keep in mind that are coming up. December 8th is the deadline for states to resolve any election disputes in their states. Then on December 14th, the electors in every state meet and they cast their ballots for the person that they're supposed to cast them for. So in Pennsylvania, if that's a state Joe Biden wins, those electors are supposed to cast their ballots for him. And then here in Washington, D.C. in January, on January 6th, Congress gets together to count those ballots, and then the election gets certified. And on January 20th at noon, President Trump is no longer the president. So there are some end dates to this, no matter what people say about whether or not they think they really won the election or not.
Well, Ed, as someone who has covered Congress for years, what do you make of what we are seeing from congressional Republicans, especially members of the Senate? What might be the calculus here for them?
Georgia, Georgia, Georgia. That's what this is about. It's designed to keep the Republican base motivated with 2 more contests to go. It's also an acknowledgement, as some senators have admitted in the last 48 hours or so, that if he loses, the president will maintain a dominant presence over the Republican Party going into the 2024 elections, when it's possible he could once again run for president. Marco Rubio, among others, was telling reporters on the Hill in the last day or so that, you know, if the president's interested in running again, he probably starts the next cycle as the front runner, undoubtedly. I mean, he's the best known guy. He has the political operation. He just won more than 70 million votes. So there's some fealty, I guess, that has to be paid to him, given that he is the leader of the party and that we know he's got the receipts to prove that if you cross him, he can cross you back and you can end up losing re-election. So you're going to see all sorts of Republican lawmakers, governors, people who want to rise through higher office across the country play safe with him, at least in the coming weeks, because without his support, many have learned you just can't cut it. You've seen senators like Rob Portman, who's up for re-election in 2 years, twist themselves in knots doing one of those classic, you know, on one hand, on the other hand kind of statements today saying, look, there was an election, it was held, the results have been counted, but on the other hand, the president has every right to, you know, seek a recount and recourse, and this whole thing will work itself out. Well, look, I mean, he's the kind of guy that in 2 years could face a Republican primary challenge, and if the president doesn't think he was doing enough for him, and if he's still a factor in Republican politics, Mr. Trump could send a tweet or two and potentially end some of these guys' careers. So it's a crass political reality, and one that they're going to have to, you know, come to grips with and continue to deal with, at least through January 20th, and possibly for many more years to come.
All right. Well, Ben, in your piece, you also mentioned the letter Attorney General Barr sent to U.S. attorneys. Why would the Attorney General make a move like that now?
Well, if the Attorney General is taking his cues from what the president's been saying, he's basically doing what the president wants done. The president would love to see investigations into alleged voter fraud, because even if there is no actual fraud there or not widespread enough fraud to change the outcome of the election, it's convenient for the president to be able to say this is being investigated by the Department of Justice. It sounds a lot more serious. So it's unclear what his actual motivation is, if that's what he's doing, is trying to give the president some cover, or if the Attorney General believes that this is something that should be looked into. But when you read the letter that he sent out last night, it's interesting. He says, you know, you're free to go investigate substantial allegations of voter fraud if that exists. But then there's this passage where it almost sounds like the Attorney General's heart isn't fully in it, where he says, but nothing that's specious or far-fetched should be investigated, should not be the basis of a claim, which is exactly what is happening in some of these states where the Trump campaign is making their claims, which have largely been dismissed by judges for lacking any evidence.
Yeah, some major caveats there in the fine print. All right, Ed O'Keefe and Ben Tracy, thank you both very much. Democrat Cal Cunningham has conceded the Senate race in North Carolina to incumbent Republican Senator Thom Tillis. CBS News projects Tillis won over Cunningham by nearly 100,000 votes. This race appeared neck and neck in the polls leading up to the election. In a statement Tuesday, Cunningham said he called Senator Tillis to congratulate him on his victory and that he, quote, wished him and his family the best in their continued service in the months and years ahead. Cunningham's concession means the balance of the Senate is now 49 Republicans to 48 Democrats. There are 2 Georgia Senate races which have advanced to runoff elections in January and will determine which party holds the majority. Coming up after the break, Obamacare goes before the Supreme Court for a 3rd time. We'll discuss why the law may survive this latest challenge, despite a conservative majority on the court. Plus, the Vatican releases a scathing report into a disgraced U.S. cardinal found guilty of sexual abuse. It says top officials ignored allegations. This is CBSN, CBS News, always on. It's official. 2020 is now the most active hurricane season on record. Subtropical storm Theta has formed over the Atlantic. It's the 29th named storm this year. However, the storm is not expected to make landfall. It's forecast to travel east and eventually dissipate over open waters. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Eta is still lingering over Gulf waters and the western tip of Cuba, sending gusty winds and rain to South Florida. The storm could gain some strength this week as it stalls over the Gulf. It's forecast to move north and could make landfall again this weekend, anywhere from the Florida Panhandle to southeast Louisiana. Heavy rain battered the Greek island of Crete Tuesday, flooding homes and streets. Drone footage shows one road completely submerged. The floodwaters also swept cars away. This is the second time in 3 weeks that the Mediterranean island has been hit with heavy flooding. Local authorities say they've rescued at least 18 people trapped in their homes and vehicles. No injuries have been reported. The Vatican has released its 2-year investigation into former U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. He was expelled from the priesthood in 2019 after the church confirmed he had sexually abused both adults and children. Chris Livesay is in Rome with more on the report's findings.
Well, this long-awaited report admits that Pope John Paul II, who made McCarrick a cardinal and appointed him to Washington, D.C., knew about allegations of sexual misconduct, but chose to ignore them and to instead take McCarrick for his word.
That we're in control of this, it'll never happen again.
Theodore McCarrick, the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., and an advisor of pontiffs, seemed above reproach. Then, last year, Pope Francis defrocked him for sexually abusing minors and adult seminarians, making McCarrick, now 90 years old, the highest-ranking official ever forced out of the priesthood in modern times. Damning evidence showed church officials knew about his wrongdoing for years. Who exactly were his enablers and how this was swept under the rug were questions that have burned for more than 2 years. Ever since Francis ordered this report by the Vatican Secretariat of State, which helped propel McCarrick to the top of the church hierarchy. Francis has promised victims to, quote, follow the path of truth wherever it may lead. Now, with this long overdue report, they hope McCarrick's fall from grace will also lead to consequences and prevention. Now, the report goes on to say that Pope Benedict did take the allegations more seriously, but not seriously enough to begin a canonical trial. And on the other hand, the report exonerates Pope Francis. Chris Livesay, CBS News, Rome.
Veteran Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat died from complications of the coronavirus Tuesday. Erekat was one of the most prominent voices of the Palestinian cause and was deeply involved in peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. MTS Tayeb is in London with more on his life and legacy.
For over 40 years, Saeb Erekat was at the heart of the Palestinian struggle for statehood, consistently fighting for a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. He was often lauded and loathed in equal measures. Israelis would accuse him of being an extremist, while hardline Palestinians would call him a traitor to the cause, saying he gave away too much. Martin Indyk, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel under both Presidents Bush and Clinton, and was appointed by President Obama to oversee peace talks with the Palestinian Authority in 2013, says the Erekat he sat with at the negotiating table was committed to nonviolence and lasting peace.
So the people that claim that he was an arch-terrorist simply don't know what they're talking about. He was a man who dedicated his life to peaceful coexistence with a Jewish state.
Saeb Erekat was born in Jerusalem in 1955. He was just 12 years old during the Six-Day War, a surprise coordinated attack on Israel by the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian armies who were not only defeated, but saw Israel seize the West Bank, Gaza, and Syria's Golan Heights. Erekat says he had to grow up quickly living in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem, but soon diplomacy would be his calling. Erekat first attracted international attention at the 1991 Madrid peace talks, where he insisted on wearing the keffiyeh, a symbol of Palestinian national identity. He was also part of the Oslo Accord peace process, where in 1995 he would ascend to the role of chief Palestinian negotiator. Throughout the years, he described a growing pessimism. He said Israel had failed to deliver on its promises of stopping Israeli settlements on the West Bank and for building a 400-mile wall of separation.
Israeli government
trying to legalize looting Palestinian land. It's a theft. It's looting Palestinian land. It is putting the last nail on the coffin of the two-state solution.
Still, Erekat remained popular among many Palestinians. He was even able to hold on to his seat in the 2006 election, which saw Hamas win by a landslide. But with Hamas's tight grip on Gaza and Benjamin Netanyahu as Israel's right-wing prime minister, the chances of any kind of peace agreement became increasingly remote. In 2018, when President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, Erekat said it would be the end of the peace process. But Indyk says in his final days, there was a renewed sense of hope.
Well, I like to believe that even though he was intubated and in a coma, he somehow knew that Donald Trump had been defeated and that President-elect Biden would revive the U.S. commitment to the two-state solution, and that he could then give up.
For a man who used diplomacy to fight for a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders for so much of his life, in his final years that goal couldn't have looked any further away. But after his death, it may have just gotten a little closer. Imtiaz Taib, CBS News, London.
The Supreme Court heard challenges to the Affordable Care Act for a third time Tuesday. Republicans hope the newly strengthened conservative majority will strike down the legislation that was a highlight of the Obama presidency. But now it appears it could survive this latest challenge. CBS News Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford reports.
It's the first challenge to the Affordable Care Act for this newly conservative Supreme Court. 18 Republican-led states, joined in part by the Trump administration, arguing Congress's decision in 2017 to eliminate a key provision in the statute. The requirement that people buy insurance or pay a penalty means the entire law must be struck down.
Because we got rid of the individual mandate.
But based on their questions, over 2 hours of arguments, a majority of the justices seem unwilling to go along, indicating they will not set aside a law that reshaped the insurance marketplace and provides health care protections for more than 20 million people. Chief Justice John Roberts.
I think it's hard for you to argue that Congress intended the entire act to fall.
Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
It does seem fairly clear that the proper remedy would be to sever the mandate provision and leave the rest of the act in place.
A majority of Americans support Obamacare. More voters who cast ballots in the election want the justices to keep it as it is than to overturn it. Today, new Justice Amy Coney Barrett gave few clues on how she sees the law. Her questions and comments were focused and highly technical.
That it would be odd for us to construe the statute as Congress saying, well, we're going to change the statute in a way that's going to render it constitutional, or this provision in a way that will render it unconstitutional.
Now, I do have a caveat. It can be hard to read these justices. They're doing the arguments by telephone. They're not here at the court in person because of the coronavirus. But based on their questions today, regardless of what Justice Barrett decides, it appears there is a majority of justices who are prepared to keep the bulk of this law in place, with a decision expected possibly by spring. Elaine?
Jan Crawford, thank you. For more on this, let's bring in Kim Whaley. She is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore and author of What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. Kim, really good to see you again. Thanks for being with us. What are the central questions the Supreme Court is considering over the Affordable Care Act?
So this is the second time, as Jan said, that this lawsuit there's been a lawsuit challenging it. The first time, essentially, the court said the individual mandate is constitutional as a tax. Congress in 2017 then went and basically said, okay, we're going to make the tax $0. Then is it a tax anymore if it's not actually getting any revenue into the federal government? That's the lawsuit now. The second lawsuit saying, okay, Congress changed the law, made the tax $0. It's no longer constitutional because it's no longer a tax. But the issue that the justices are dealing with, two things primarily. One is whether the plaintiffs the state of Texas, for example, are even injured by that at this point. The law is functioning, and they made pretty strained arguments to say that they were injured. Without an injury, you can't be in court. The second is essentially, even if you just say, okay, the individual mandate is now struck down because it's not legitimately a tax anymore, does the entire act have to fail? And that's what we heard with Justice Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts when they were saying, well, Congress amended the statute in 2017 to make the tax or the penalty zero. And at that point, they could have struck down the entire law, and they didn't. So why should we do it now when they didn't even do it when this whole thing was before Congress?
So what exactly is different now that could potentially lead to a different outcome? Obviously, we have a different composition on the high court now.
Yeah, so I think it's really telling, frankly, that two justices, Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts, went on the record to say, we think the Affordable Care Act is going to stand. Because even if they strike down the individual mandate, that's not going to make a huge change for people. I think they wanted to send a message, and Justice Kavanaugh in particular is pretty stunning, actually, as a conservative Trump appointee. Chief Justice Roberts is now the swing vote with Justice Kennedy gone. Justice Kavanaugh is coming out and saying, listen, I'm not touching this one. This is for Congress, and it seems really clear what the language of the statute is. I'm not going to do much with it. So, what's different about it this time is that we've seen, I think, some years now of the Affordable Care Act actually functioning, more years than the first time it came up.